This is Unit 10 for Qualitative Research Methods in Criminal Justice, and I am your professor for this class, Dr. Anita Black. This unit covers Chapter 10 from Tracy's textbook and covers the art of interpretation, describes computer-aided qualitative data analysis software, and offers overviews of 6 ways to analyze data. You can use just one strategy, or you can mix these techniques in a way that makes sense with your own theoretical framing. So let's look now at the overview for this unit. First, we're going to discuss advanced logistical tools, exemplars and vignettes, typologies, dramatistic strategy and narrative analysis, metaphor analysis, explanation and causality, discourse tracing, and then we're going to close with a slide on post-qualitative analysis using deconstructionism. Let's first discuss visual data displays. These will help your readers make sense of your research data. So over the course of your research, you may have spoken with hundreds of participants and you may have read thousands of articles. After you've collected all of this data, you need to be able to make sense of it all for yourself and for your reader. And that's what the visual data displays attempt to do by using samples in visual displays or tables, matrices, flowcharts, and models. Now, none of these types of displays will be new or groundbreaking to you, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're easy to create. Even if it doesn't end up in your final product, visualizing data can help you as the researcher make interesting connections and think creatively about the data. So be sure and check out the Researcher's Notepad 10.1 on page 239 for an example of a matrix display. A matrix in particular can be helpful in the creation of a typology, which we're going to discuss later on in this lecture. Next, we have an acronym, which is however you want to pronounce it or however you want to say it. Almost looks like cactus, so just cactus. This is an acronym for Computer-Aided Qualitative Data Analysis Software. So these are software programs that are designed specifically to help the researcher analyze qualitative data. But this software does not analyze data on its own. Instead, this type of software facilitates data analysis. The advantages of this qualitative analysis software are to add ability to sort, organize, and conduct searches that are within the data. You can also use this software to write in the software and code them as you would other data. But some researchers have reservations about using this type of software. There's a fear that taking human understanding that is gained in the field and then inserting it into the computer somehow can stretch the data of its humanity. So whether this is true or not, there are more tangible disadvantages of the software analysis, such as the cost of software, its availability, and the learning curve to develop proficiency using the software. So researchers who have lots of data or plan on doing maybe more than one qualitative project, the advantages of this software are likely going to outweigh the disadvantages of using it. So here's a little bit more about the analysis software and its features. Software helps researchers with coding the data. You can quickly apply new codes that you've created with the data that you encounter later on in the coding process. Compare variables across various cases. In other words, your data is all in one place on the computer rather than scattered across your dinner table. So instead of having to sort through all of your piles of material, the computer allows the researcher to quickly compare. For instance, one interview with another, as well as this software allows us to link to external legends. So this is obviously especially helpful when you're dealing with text that's taken from the internet. This might also be useful for linking data with supporting material that you find along with the creation of models, and it can count the frequency of certain codes. Now, this would be incredibly helpful for determining the importance of certain key terms that arise within the data collection process. And finally, this software helps us check the consistency of data analysis. Again, all of your information and all of your data, all of your analysis is in one place when you use software. It's making comparisons quicker and easier. So if you're interested in using computer-aided qualitative data analysis software, the first step would be to choose which software package that is right for you. And so the most common software packages are listed on Blackboard within the unit. So if you want to check out any of these software packages, you can see the links to 7 of them, of the most popular ones. So after you figure out what software you actually want to use, what package is right for your data and your study, you would have to purchase the software. So we spoke briefly on this on the last slide about cost, but you should know that there are usually discounted rates for shorter term and for student versions of these software packages. So if you're using a software package for your study, you want to check with the university, see what's available to you as maybe part of your student technology fee, and finally, you should probably go with, goes without saying, but it's helpful to use the manuals and the online tutorials if you need assistance using these programs. So, but trying to jump in to doing this data collection is not recommended, but you need to tinker with the data analysis software. Just jump into working with the software before you actually add in your data. So it's really good to find a tutorial from the software company, maybe a message board, or like us, if you check for YouTube, you can always find something there to help you. So let's talk now about exemplars and vignettes. Tracy tells us that exemplars and vignettes serve as an embodiment of an inductive construct or claim. But I'm not sure that this section of the book is entirely clear enough about what this actually means. As a qualitative researcher, you are trying to demonstrate something or to understand something better. So you may even be trying to convince the world out there that it needs change in some way on some topic. Exemplars and vignettes are real or contrived situations that demonstrate, in the words of the participant, the point that you're trying to make. So what is the difference between exemplars and vignettes? Tracy tells us that exemplars are multifaceted examples that researchers identify in the data. In other words, an interview or focus group is conducted, and the participants will tell you in their own words about a situation that actually occurred that perfectly demonstrates which you were trying to say. So, for instance, Tracy provides an example of the emotional experiences of a correctional officer on page 245 and 246. But what if you don't find a perfect example in your data? Then you would use a constructed vignette. Let me get down there. Constructed vignettes are reconstructed examples of a specific claim or example that's made by the researcher. So in other words, you take the descriptions that you collected along the way about an event or a situation, and you make connections about that data. And then you go back into the field to talk to the participants about that situation. So in a way, this may seem like, you're fishing for information, but this is very important. So you need to consider ethics whenever you're using and constructing vignettes. It's one thing to search for understanding or meaning. It's quite another thing to lead the participant down the road where he or she will only answer in the way that you want them to. That's not what you're doing. It's okay, and it's even recommended to use examples in vignettes that are not only sensational, but also typical and mundane. The stories you use don't have to bring the readers to tears, but your goal as a researcher should be to make and support your point with the people that you have that have experienced the world firsthand, who are your participants. Here are some guidelines or tips for speaking with a participant about a situation when constructing exemplars and vignettes. With vignettes, you should consider the context, participants' hopes, who is involved, what they did, what happened as a result, what the impact was, why this happened, and the expectations for future predictions and what was learned. With regard to exemplars and vignettes, again, when using vignettes and exemplars, we have to be ethical with the participant's word that's to not be taken out of context. Or the researcher could use a participant's words to make any point that they want to. So as we've talked about throughout the course, we need to be self-reflexive. We need to recognize when our own biases might be overriding the truth that's actually coming out of the data. Also, we don't want to conflate chronology with causality. We're going to talk a little bit more about this later, but just because something happens first does not necessarily mean that it calls for sensations to occur. So it's not because it happens first, it's not causing the second. So as we've stated previously, we need to avoid the more sensational examples. So for instance, sometimes in the news we hear about the horrible things that are happening in society. And because these horrible actions are giving such top billing on the news, and because they're repeated over and over again, we start to believe that we are witnessing an epidemic, that these horrible things are happening all around us all the time, like with the school shootings. When we hear about them, we think they're absolutely horrible, which they are, but we think, are they increasing? And when you go back and really look at the number of shootings now as opposed to 20 years ago, they're not that big a difference. So don't let one sensational story in your data cloud or bias the entirety of the data. And the flip side of that coin is that mundane situations should also be used and can also be telling. So don't just rush the user's story because you think it's the juiciest, but be honest with yourself and the reader about the entirety of your research. Let's move on to typology. A typology is a system for classifying ways of doing something. Researchers can identify a conceptual big bin and then connect it with related smaller concepts, ideas, processes, or types. These can serve to be part of your research, or, as we're saying, the entirety of your research. So, for instance, a typology can make up a subset of an analysis, such as the example from Tracy in the book, the types of nicknames that are used by 9/11 operators. But typologies can also frame an entire story, such as what Orb and Allen talk about in their article that's mentioned in the textbook. Typologies, when used especially for the entire study, are especially useful for the creation of theory. If you can create distinctions with meaning, you might be able to predict future behavior among those types that you've created. Okay, so now let's move on to the dramatistic strategy. Tracy tells us that Burke created the dramatistic pentad as a tool to analyze how speakers persuade audiences that their view of the reality is true. The pentad is comprised of 5 elements of human drama, including act, agent, agency, purpose, and scene. The pentad helps individuals to analyze several parallel scenes of action in different contexts. So the pentad also serves as a powerful way to map out interview data. So if you look at table 10.2 on page 251 for an example of how Meisenbach and his colleagues used the pentad to examine maternity leave practice. And also be sure to check out the additional AV material that's on the unit on Blackboard. For more information on the dramatistic pentad, you also see here the term narrative analysis. Now, narrative analysis is related to the pentad, and it looks at how people talk about their lives with an audience in mind. So the narratives are typically made up of the abstract, orientation, complication, evaluation, resolution, and coda, all of which are defined in Table 10.1 on page 249. Also, I recommend to see the Tips and Tools 10.2 on page 250, and this asks questions that inspire narrative analysis. Next, we move on to metaphor analysis in the course of speaking with our observing participants in the scene. We may hear them use metaphors to describe a situation. Now, metaphors compare one thing to another, and in doing so, try to provide a vivid picture of the scene. But metaphors differ in their level of complexity. So we have dead metaphors and we have live metaphors. The dead metaphors are difficult to even hear as metaphors because they're just so common. One of the examples that Tracy gives is the teeth of the saw. So when we hear that, we know exactly what is meant by the teeth of the saw because we're so used to using that. So the metaphor is considered dead. But researchers aren't really interested in dead metaphors so much as live metaphors. Live metaphors require context and an understanding of an activity to interpret. So, for example, I might say, my boss is like a drill sergeant. Well, that's something that we actually have to think about. Like, what does that mean for the boss to act like a drill sergeant? Does that mean he wears the BDUs? Does that mean he salutes at me? Is he doing something that makes him act like a drill sergeant? So live metaphors, on the other hand, help to create meaning and influence how participants make meaning in future interactions. And there are various ways to conduct a metaphor analysis. So first, we have the forced metaphor approach, which specifically asks participants to provide metaphors. Now, a disadvantage of this method, though, is that people have trouble naming metaphors. Instead, researchers could develop a list of metaphors and then ask participants to rank those metaphors. Another approach is the ideographic metaphor approach. Now, this analyzes metaphors as they emerge in the data. So researchers look for metaphors from within. It's the way participants describe their own situations. Now, finally, researchers can also create a metaphor that sums up the data for themselves. Moving on through the analysis slides, we have explanation and causality. As Tracy tells us, qualitative data are not only excellent for answering the question of what is going on here, but also the questions of why and how come. These questions in analyzing data lead to findings that are related to prediction, action, and change. But many researchers falsely believe that qualitative methods cannot provide explanation and then calls out rather than a broad scale societal explanations. Qualitative researchers can provide local causality or describe how local events and processes lead to specific outcomes in specific context. Researchers mustn't link antecedents or what happened before to consequences in order to demonstrate causality. Researchers can play with concessions of time by asking if X happens, then Y happens. These types of questions. But, and this is very important, correlation is different from causation. Correlation means that the two issues are co-occurring rather than that one action causes the other action. So if we're doing this sort of explanation in causality analysis with qualitative research, how can we strengthen our claims that causation is occurring? Making predictions about why something occurred is enhanced by using comparative data. For instance, showing how actions occurred both with and without some other type of action or stimuli. Also, causal explanations of a scene can be strengthened through member reflections, through the words of the participants themselves. And finally, let's discuss discourse tracing on the next two slides. To finish up, we're going to talk about discourse tracing on the next two slides. Discourse tracing appears to be very important to Tracy's work, so I suggest that you read through her discussion on the topic That's on pages 255 through 258. Now, discourse tracing is for researchers who want to analyze data from multiple structural levels and examine changes over time. There are 3 different levels that we are asked to consider: the micro, the meso, and the macro. Micro level data examines everyday talk and interaction. Meso examines mid-level policies and procedures and informal behaviors that are described by authority. Macro level considers larger walls, societal myths, and enduring ideologies. And you can learn more of these levels of interaction on the notepad 10.2 on page 257. Also, for an example, Tracy mentions casing. Now, casing refers to the analytic process where researchers choose, invoke, or construct a case that links theory today that we can then analyze the findings in a way that contributes to larger theoretical concerns in terms of steps. Now, discourse tracing involves several analysis steps. First, the researcher identifies a rupture or a turning point. So, for instance, what we might otherwise call a focusing event, like September 11th or a hurricane, the researcher gathers all the micro, meso, and macro level data on the topic and organizes it chronologically. The researcher then considers how certain outcomes were affected by specific policies, decisions, or practices along the way. Structured questions that consider past research and emergent codes are then created to lift specific answers from the data. So that being said, chronological ordering as structured questions aren't exclusive to discourse tracing alone. It can also be helpful to researchers who are not using discourse tracing. So there are good practices to use whether you're doing discourse tracing or not. So let's look at when researchers should use discourse tracing. Discourse tracing is for researchers who are working with multi-level data, interested in changes over time, and are comparing various cases or context. This is the last slide to wrap up this unit. The unit ends this discussion of post-qualitative analysis by Tracy telling us that post-quality of scholars have critiqued the rules and processes of typical qualitative analysis. And many scholars, for example, will immerse themselves in the theory and writing as methods of inquiry. But Tracy argues that coding and other forms of analysis are also forms of inquiry, and she mentions deconstructionism. So deconstructionism includes drawing attention to symbols or discourses that are absent. So you're insinuating foundational oppositions or in reimagining unaltered meaning. She provides an example of deconstructionism with this photograph by Chris Buck. And so you can see here on the slide where you have Asian women sitting in chairs and they're laughing and having a good time. And then you have white women who are working on their feet, massaging their feet, scraping their feet. And when we look at this image, it's jarring to us because we're used to just the opposite of what happens here. We're used to the white women sitting in the chairs and the Asian women working silently on their feet. So this is a drawing. This is drawing attention to our assumptions about how the world operates and then shows us that there may be problems with our current social structure. So that is it for this week, and I hope it wasn't too long. And again, if you have any questions, please post them under the virtual hours in the discussion forum.